Mrs. Austen found her insipid, and Jane's niece Anna couldn't bear her. The reception of Fanny, combined with the fact that Edmund Bertram is no Mr. Darcy, definitely prevented Mansfield Park becoming as successful as Pride and Prejudice. However, Egerton did sell his first run of 1,250 copies by November, but he refused to print a second edition. This was enough to set Jane looking for a new publisher for her next novel, Emma. She was confident about this novel, even allowing the reader the freedom to dislike her heroine.
I am going to take a heroine whom no one but myself will much like.
Jane Austen knew that a heroine like Emma, who we would love to hate, particularly in the early part of the novel, would enhance her story. Just as with Pride and Prejudice, she opens Emma very quickly, and we are soon equally engrossed.
Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her.
Emma and her father, the neurotic Mr. Woodhouse, occupy Hartfield, the grandest house in Highbury, a large village. Here we see the town of Leatherhead, which according to Jane's nephew James Austen Leigh was the inspiration for Highbury. I am writing to say that my aunt, Miss Jane Austen, once told me that the Highbury described in her novel Emma was the town of Leatherhead. Emma considers herself to be the grand lady of the village, and with no one but her doting father to correct her, she causes havoc, trying to arrange marriages for all those around her. That is, until her older, handsome brother-in-law, Mr. Knightley, tries to take her in hand and stop her meddling. As the story develops, a mystery unfolds before us, and the reader needs to turn detective. Handsome newcomer Frank Churchill seems to have a very strange effect on genteel, educated, but catastrophically poor Jane Fairfax, the niece of well-intentioned but eccentric Miss Bates. Emma is taken in by Mr. Churchill and, egged on by his indiscreet behaviour, is unforgivably rude to Miss Bates on a visit they all make to Box Hill. In her heart, Emma knows she's done wrong, but she tries to laugh it off as a silly joke. Mr. Knightley tells her in no uncertain terms that she of all people should have known better. He also warns her about Frank Churchill, so when the Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax riddle is answered, Emma has her own mortification to deal with, as well as knowing that she should have listened to Mr. Knightley. It is at this point when Emma is at her most vulnerable, coping with painful self-enlightenment, that Mr. Knightley declares his love for her. Emma has the grace to accept him and appreciate his value to her. It is not only Emma, however, who learns from these experiences. Jane Austen seems to thoroughly enjoy shaking up Mr. Knightley. For a man who has said precisely what he thinks at every previous point in the novel, this proposal takes a bit of deciphering. Here Jane Austen's style has matured richly, charging this passage with more than humour. There is a real understanding of the nature of the human condition. "I cannot make speeches, Emma," he soon resumed, and in a tone of such sincere, decided, intelligible tenderness, and was tolerably convincing. "If I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more, but you know what I am, you hear nothing but truth from me. I have blamed you and lectured you, and you have borne it as no other woman in England would have borne it. Bear with the truths I would tell you now, dearest Emma, as well as you have borne with them. The manner, perhaps, may have as little to recommend them. God knows I have been a very indifferent lover, but you understand me. Yes, you see, you understand my feelings, and will return them if you can." As with her previous novels, it was Henry who advised Jane about getting a more committed publisher for Emma, but as Henry's health was poor at the time, it was Jane herself who applied to John Murray, a major publisher and friend of Sir Walter Scott and Lord Byron. Jane was staying with Henry at Hans Place to help to nurse him, and when Murray replied, he offered £450 to buy the copyright of Emma, but he also wanted the copyright of Mansfield Park and Sense and Sensibility included. Jane was rather amused and called him a rogue, but a civil one. It was all a rather slow, drawn-out process, until she made the decision to dedicate Emma to the Prince Regent, who was known to be a collector of her work. At first, it had been in deference to Mr. James Stainer Clark, the Prince's librarian at Carlton House. Her relationship with Mr. Clark is an interesting one. Jane was introduced to him while she was staying with Henry at Hans Place. Jane admired Mr. Clark's work, but when he made a suggestion about the storyline for her next novel, she resisted his helpful advice. She chose her subjects carefully and, interestingly, was always concerned about disgracing her previous work. Although she was pleased with Emma, she still worried about its reception, feeling it inferior in wit to Pride and Prejudice and lacking the good sense of Mansfield Park. The royal dedication, despite her reservations, did her nothing but good. Murray certainly moved at a much faster pace once the dedication was in place. In the end, Emma was published at the author's own expense with a 10% commission payable to Murray. Murray also published a second edition of Mansfield Park. Emma, with its grand royal dedication, was well received, but Mansfield Park was a disaster, even for Murray. It ended up being remaindered at 2 shillings and 6pence a copy instead of the wholesale price of 12 and 6. Jane Austen finished Emma on the 29th of March 1815 and began Persuasion, her last completed novel, on the 8th of August 1815. It was just a month later that Jane's health began to fail. She had Addison's disease. Not that anyone could have known this at the time, as the disease was not documented until 1849. Jane slowly became more debilitated by her condition, deteriorating as Persuasion progressed. Yet again, Jane Austen manages to find an original heroine, the overlooked and much put upon Anne Elliot, who is completely different to those who had passed before. Jane described Anne as almost too good for her, and we watch the more mature Anne, aged 27, uncomplaining but fading away into the non-entity of spinsterdom before our very eyes. Anne's father is an impoverished baronet whose imprudent extravagance has been his downfall. This description sums him up.
Sir Walter Elliot of Kellynch Hall in Somersetshire was a man who, for his own amusement, never took up any book but the baronetage. There he found occupation for an idle hour and consolation in a distressed one. This was the page at which the favourite volume always opened. Elliot of Kellynch Hall.
As a result of his impropriety, their family home is let and the family moved to live in Bath. 8 years before the novel began, Anne had been engaged to a Captain Wentworth, a poor but respectable naval man, but is persuaded by a friend to break off the engagement. Anne has regretted this, and at the beginning of Persuasion, she has given up all hope of finding love again. The novel has some of Jane Austen's most descriptive passages, taking us from Somerset to Bath and on to Lyme Regis. There is an underlying autumnal theme, as this passage illustrates.
Her pleasure in the walk must arise from the exercise and the day, from the view of the last smiles of the year upon the tawny leaves and withered hedges, and from repeating to herself some few of the 1,000 poetical descriptions extant of autumn, that season of peculiar and inexhaustible influence on the mind of taste and tenderness.
The plot is enhanced by the new tenant of Kellynch Hall, Admiral Croft, being the husband of Captain Wentworth's sister. Captain Wentworth sweeps back into Anne's life, having made his fortune, rendering him on his return most eligible. Anne has the indignity of watching other young ladies set their caps at him, while her heart still aches because of her undying love for him. She silently waits, and her patience is rewarded when Captain Wentworth declares that he has never stopped loving her, and Anne glories in becoming a sailor's wife. Jane Austen herself would have liked to have been a sailor's wife, and no doubt she wrote the happy ending that she would have chosen for herself. Fortune did not smile upon Jane, and sadly she did not live to see Persuasion published, let alone find a sailor to marry. She did begin another novel called Sanditon, which had all the hallmarks of an epic Victorian novel. Her wit was as sharp and brilliant as it had been in Pride and Prejudice, and despite her illness, Jane was still moving with the times. Sanditon, if completed, would have been a satirical novel about a changing society, which would have marked yet another development in Jane Austen's maturing literary ability. John Murray published Persuasion in 1818, a year after Jane Austen's death on July the 18th, 1817. Henry Austen arranged this, and it was combined with the manuscript brought back from Crosby, revised as Northanger Abbey. Although Jane Austen enjoyed the thought of earning money from her writing, she spent very little of it, and her beloved sister Cassandra inherited the grand sum of £561 and 2 shillings. For us, Jane Austen also left a legacy, 6 very precious and priceless novels that take the modern reader back to the Regency period. Despite the lack of political statement, we are left with a snapshot of a moment in time, and perhaps because of that very lack of political content, we have 6 novels blessed with great readability. Sometimes this readability disguises the fact that Jane Austen underpinned all of her writing with a strong sense of morality. Jane may have allowed us to laugh at her characters who lacked moral fibre, but no good comes of any of them. It is only the naturally good or the morally reformed who win through in the end. By using humour so effectively, we perhaps accept Jane Austen's moral judgments far more readily than we would if her writing had taken a more serious tone. It is appropriate, therefore, to give Jane Austen the last word, because it was she who understood better than anyone else, past, present or future, just exactly what she was capable of. She stuck to what she did well, did it in her own way, and refused to be swayed by flattery to be anything less than true to herself. This is the secret of her success.
I could not sit seriously down to write a serious romance under any other motive than to save my life. And if it were indispensable for me to keep it up and never relax into laughing at myself or at other people, I'm sure I should be hung before I'd finished the first chapter. No, I must keep to my own style and go on in my own way. And though I may never succeed again in that, I am convinced that I should totally fail in any other.